Welcome back to the ChessGoals YouTube channel. In today's video, we're going to have a member game overview from PrestaJay. He's one of the original ChessGoals members. He's a moderator of ChessGoals. Really great guy. I like him a lot. And this is one of his recent OTB games, and his opponent went 5-0 in this event. And he wanted me to specifically kind of go through the opening and the middle game phase, talk about some different strategic plans and some things that he could have done differently in there. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at this from PrestaJay's point of view, playing the black pieces. Let's jump right into it. So his opponent starts off with e4. PrestaJay plays e5, knight f3, knight c6. So this usually heads into a Ruy Lopez, which is what happens. Bishop to b5, a6, the bishop retreats, knight f6. All this is very standard so far. We see castling by white, bishop to e7, rook e1, b5, bishop to b3. So I'm not going to go too much into that part of the theory. That's all pretty standard Ruy Lopez stuff. Now at this point though, one thing I wanted to mention, this is more of a general chess principle that also applies to the Ruy Lopez. In this type of position, when you have a bishop that's being kicked around by pawns like this, it's good to think about the bishop pair, right? So the bishop pair means one side has two bishops and the other side maybe has a bishop and a knight or two knights in return. That's one imbalance that you can use to play with when you start to think of pawn structure and different strategic ideas. So here, what white wants to do is preserve both of those bishops. And the way they preserve this bishop on b3 is typically they'll move the c-pawn and tuck the bishop back onto c2. And from c2, that bishop points at the black king side. And the reason I'm bringing all this up is because in the game, after d6, white played pawn to h3, which is actually a small mistake. It looks like a pretty normal move, right? We're preventing bishop to g4 by black. But this is a small mistake because what you can do here, PrestaJay, is you can play knight to a5, immediately attacking this bishop on b3, and this is gaining the bishop pair. There's no way for white to get out of that. So for example, let's say c3 is played, knight takes bishop, pawn takes back, bishop to b7, you can target this e-pawn twice. You have knight and bishop attacking it. And after something like d3, you can play c5, which is the idea you used in the game, expand on the queen side. This is all looking very good for black. You're going to castle. So small edge for black here because you got that bishop pair, and really the rest of the position is pretty balanced outside of the bishop pair. You're going to castle on the next move. You're not really behind it in development at all. And one thing to note, so back when d6 was played, knight a5 doesn't quite work here. That's a question that I thought you might be asking as a viewer. If knight a5 was played immediately trying to get the bishop pair, it looks like that bishop doesn't have any safe squares to avoid the trade. But here white can grab the pawn on e5. And now if black goes for the bishop pair, a takes b3, we see white is up that extra e-pawn. There's no compensation for black really. The bishop pair is there for black, but having that extra center pawn that black can't win back is much too large of an advantage for white. The bishop pair doesn't even come close to equalizing that out. So knight a5 was not a good move on move 7 because it drops the e-pawn. So after d6, h3 though, knight a5 is a great move here, and that's going to give black an advantage already on move 8. All right, so let's see what happened in the game. PrestaJay castled, which is the normal plan if white plays c3, the correct move order. Now knight to a5 was played, most common move, bishop c2, c5, very good queenside expansion. I think PrestaJay is showing very good knowledge of this type of position as well. And after pawn to d4, PrestaJay again plays the best move, queen c7, and all of these dark squares are being guarded by the queen, right? So it's a very solid structure for black, fighting back for that space in the center. Perfect move. Now white plays b3. This is a bit of an inaccuracy. I gave it a dubious symbol, and you see the question mark with the exclam. I think this is a bit strange because usually what white wants to do here is play knight to d2, reroute that knight to f1, and then bring out the c1 bishop, usually through the king side. That's the typical plan. I don't really understand b3 here. It just feels a little bit strange. I don't know if white wants bishop to b2, but that's not what I'm used to seeing at least. Now PrestaJay plays c takes d4. I think that's a good decision. C takes d, and knight back to c6. All of this looks great to me. I think the position is equal, black is equalized, and I really like how you're playing this PrestaJay. Bishop to b2 was played in the game. Now knight to b4. Great move. So we're 14 moves deep, and honestly, it feels like black is slightly outplaying white here. There was just that one missed opportunity on move 8 to grab the bishop pair, but now black is getting the bishop pair again, and I feel like PrestaJay, you've played very high level chess up until this point. Um, and I think white's doing a pretty good job too. Just a couple inaccuracies by white, like castling before c3, or I mean h3 instead of c3, and then b3 also looked a little bit funny to me, but overall, no big mistakes by white. So now white plays bishop to d3, and here we see knight takes d3, queen takes d3, and on the next move is the first mistake by PrestaJay. So this is where I really want to kind of focus on the imbalances and the strategic nature of the position. I think this was a great game to submit PrestaJay for analysis because this is one where we can really go deep and talk about planning and imbalances. And I love the strategic richness of this position. All right, so when we have the bishop pair, these two bishops, and the opponent has a bishop and knight in return, usually we want the bishops to be open. Bishops like open positions, and the way you tend to open positions is to trade pawns. So something like e takes d4, for example, would open the position. That's what was played in the game, and I think that is the first move I would consider. But I want to circle back to that after we go through some other options, since that's the move played in the game. One thing I wanted to mention too, if you like PrestaJay is one of your favorite people, put a comment down below and just say, I love PrestaJay. I want to see how many people say I love PrestaJay in the comments. All right, so the other moves I would consider, one is knight to d7. This is the move that solidifies the pawn on e5. So if we look at the main threat here by white, it's d takes e. This is going to win a pawn for white. So I think the first thing I would consider after e takes d is, can we play knight to d7 and just hold on tight and not give white a pawn? This feels very cramped though. Once you kind of go deeper into the line, let's say white plays knight to c3, eyeing the d5 square, bishop to b7. But now there's rook a to c1, lining up with the queen. Queen moves. Well, now there's knight to d5. And at this point, white is going to get the bishop pair back. White is going to eliminate black's bishop pair advantage, right? This is going to be captured on e7, or black has to take on d5, and white has the better piece placement after the trades, right? So this is an advantage for white. So I don't really like playing a passive move like knight to d7 and just giving white everything in the position, right? When we think of imbalances, we want to have different things to fight for. We want to have ways to play for a win. We want to have ways to pressure the opponents, pose the tough questions to them, get our opponents to make mistakes. If they control everything, we really want to avoid that. So I think I would roll out knight to d7 there. The next thing I would look for is, can we defend this e-pawn with tactics? Or can we play in a dynamic way where we actually give up the e-pawn, knowing that we have the initiative in the end? And the way I would look to do that here is develop some pieces that haven't been developed yet. So one move I would look at is rook to d8. Another move that I would look at is bishop to b7. But let's look at rook to d8. I think this is one that I would probably consider as my third option. So option one being to take, which I don't like, and we'll talk about that in a second. Option two being knight to d7, which I don't like because it's too passive. So then I would come to, can we play a more active move, maybe sacrifice to get some dynamic play? And that's rook to d8. So let's say in this position, white plays d takes e5, trying to win the pawn. We're going to take back. Now we see the rook lined up with the queen. So let's say bishop takes e5 for white. This is the way that white wins the pawn. At this point, we can take the queen, let white take our queen, and then play bishop to b7. And look what's happening in this position. We just got this bishop developed, this rook developed, this knight is on a great square, targeting the extra white pawn. This a8 rook is ready to come into the game the next move, and this e7 bishop is also ready to develop in one move. And white has these pieces sitting back here on the queen side. This pawn is attacked, about to be captured. This bishop is a little bit loose on our side of the board. And also, the f3 knight is attacked by both our bishop and rook potentially. Right? So there's a lot going on here in terms of dynamic play, and a lot of that play favors us at the cost of only one pawn, right? So white has a material advantage, but we have a lot of play in return. That's the type of position I like when we come from a position where white seemed to have the advantage and we were looking for a way to fight back, right? So this is something where I think black has a very good chance to win this in practical play. And I didn't really appreciate giving up material for the initiative until I was probably like close to 2200 USCF. I think for me personally, it was something very hard to grasp the concept because I'm so material based. Um, kind of growing up as a chess player, I always counted the pieces, right? I didn't want to sacrifice the exchange. I didn't want to sacrifice too many pawns unless I knew it was like a straight gambit out of the opening. But one thing that I've started to realize as I've grown as a chess player is how to balance dynamic play with material. And here we definitely have the play for the material. So now let's go to e takes d4, which was played in the game. So e takes d4, white plays knight takes d4. But what happens now is we see this d6 pawn has become sort of the weakest pawn on the board. And white's pieces are well placed on both b2 and d4, right? That bishop is well placed, the knight is well placed. The knight controls a lot of squares. So at this point, I would be thinking kind of along the same lines as the last move. Can we play very dynamically and just blow this position open? That's especially true having the two bishops. And I think at this point, if I were just thrown into this game, I would already feel that black is a little bit worse. And I think I would be okay with equalizing, right? So if I have to give up the bishop pair to get into an endgame that's equal, I'm okay with that. And then maybe I can play for a win out of an equal position. But right now, the position is better for white, right? So sometimes we have to be okay with equality. At this point, knight to d7 was played. And this was a mistake. And we'll look at why. But I think the move that I would probably play after a lot of consideration is pawn to d5. You do have to calculate this out. The reason I like this move is because we're immediately trying to get rid of that d6 weakness. And at this point, I think there's a tough decision for white, right? If you're looking at this with an engine, the decision's not so hard. But put yourself in white's shoes here. This pawn is about to be captured on e4. Is white going to push, take, or defend? They have to choose. And none of them really give up anything for black. From this position to playing d5, I don't think we're really making any big concessions, but we are giving white a tough question. So let's say white pushes past. That's a good move, but we can play knight to e4, right? Now all of a sudden our knight's getting some play. We're using this D pawn as a strength instead of a weakness, right? That's a big switch for us in a good way. Also, I think this position is a little bit hard to play for white as well, in terms of finding the best stockfish moves and trying to keep that advantage. So what are the other options for white? E5, knight e4, we're pretty happy with that. Well, let's say e takes d5. Now we're going to play knight takes d5, and look at all these arrows I drew. Both our bishops are coming into the game. Bishop f6, bishop to b7. Our rook is coming to d8. And that knight on d5 controls a lot of advanced squares on white's half of the board. I love this position already compared to what we had prior to playing d5. Okay, let's look at one more option. What if white plays knight to c3, defending the pawn on e4? Well, now we can take on e4. Knight takes back. Bishop to b7. The d6 weakness is gone. And look at how the black pieces are finally coming back to life. You do have to probably admit that this position is maybe a little bit better for white because white has really good well-placed pieces. but our pieces have improved quite a bit um, from that position where we had the pawn on d6. So I think this is a critical moment, and I would really look to play d5 first. And looking at it, I feel like it works, so I would probably go with that. If I didn't feel like d5 was a great option or I was a little unsure, I would look at developing moves next, like maybe bishop to b7, or maybe bringing a rook into the game, rook to d8 even, trying to prepare d5, something along those lines. So in the game, knight to d7 was played, and then white played knight to f5, so getting very active. Knight to e5 was played. Only good move by black. This was a nice find by PrestaJay. And now knight takes e7 with check. Queen takes e7, queen to e3. And this is kind of the last critical moment of the game, and I think this was another spot where PrestaJay wanted to hear my thoughts. Kind of thinking strategically here, but also eyeing the tactics. f5, I think, is the strategic way to play this position, and PrestaJay played f5 in the game. So the positive here, PrestaJay, is you showed very good understanding, I think, of this pawn structure. f5 is a nice way to play this position if you can get the pawn back after e takes f. The problem here is it just doesn't quite work tactically because after e takes f, the e5 knight is pinned. So f4 is about to be played on the very next move, and there's no safe way to capture back this pawn on f5. But what you can do here, instead of playing f5, you could prep it, bishop to b7. So let's give white a developing move. Let's say knight to c3. Now you can get away with f5. And there's kind of a cool tactic here. So you have to use tactics to make the strategic idea work in this position. And that's partially because white's pieces are so well placed that the tactics tend to favor white. So that's something that I talk about quite a bit. Get your pieces on good squares, keep them active, have the initiative. The tactics will tend to be in your favor in those cases. So let's say here white plays e takes f, rook takes f5, pawn to f4, trying to utilize the pin. There's this cool move, rook to e8. So that's using tactics to make sure that we're not dropping any material. We're actually going to be up material. If f takes e is played, rook takes e. And now there's only one move for white to save this position. It's actually going to be losing if white doesn't find the only move because of rook takes e1 about to be played. Knight to d5. It's only saving move. It's a crazy option. Black is still better though. After rook takes e3, knight takes check, rook takes back. These rooks swap. Black is now up the d6 pawn. It's not a weakness. It's a pass pawn. It's a strength. Opposite colored bishops, but with rooks on the board. So that's going to give black some attacking chances. All right, so to recap, PrestaJay, I think this was a very good game. You had a good understanding of the opening. You had a good understanding of the middle game plans, the bishop pair. I think all of the pieces were in place there, and it just came down to a couple critical decisions. And I give your opponent a lot of credit. I think they did a good job. When you did make those mistakes, they were able to capitalize. So there's probably three critical moments, I would say. The first one is when white played h3, kind of knowing this idea to play knight to a5, grabbing that bishop pair right away. And I think the second critical moment was right here when you played e takes d4. I would look to play actively, something like rook to d8. And the third critical moment was right here. I would play pawn to d5, try to open that position up right away. And if you can get that c8 bishop into the game next, things are looking pretty good at that point. I hope you guys enjoyed this game review. This was PrestaJay. He's a moderator in our Discord server. Really nice guy. PrestaJay, thanks for submitting the game. Please give the video a thumbs up. I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.